we get started with tonight's lesson, which is on Joshua chapter 6, and a couple of guys are passing out some handouts. One announcement that we failed to get into Miller's hands, our brother Nat Medlin is experiencing some challenges that are, at least in part, maybe altogether, associated with kidney stones. Some of you have been there, so please, in your prayers, remember Nat and the difficulty that he's going through with kidney stones. All right, now, if you have been here the last few weeks, you're certainly caught up with where we are. We've been studying the book of Joshua. Chapter 3, going back a couple of weeks, chapter 3, they crossed the Jordan. All of them get across the Jordan for the first time. Chapter 4 dwelled on the memorial stones and the importance of those stones. Chapter 5, they remedy an overlooked requirement. At the beginning of that chapter and then at the end of chapter 5 is that somewhat strange, mysterious at least, encounter with a person who identifies himself as the commander of the Lord's army. Now, tonight we go into chapter 6 of Joshua, which this title on your sheet is a title that David used in his prep lesson, which I'm using and I've added to a little bit, the fall of Jericho. Just as a sort of a reminder, if you can draw in your mind's eye, see in your mind's eye, the Holy Lands, and we all know that the Red Sea, Dead Sea rather, the Dead Sea is primarily runs north and south. It's a lot more slender east and west than it is deep north and south. So picture, if you will, that Dead Sea. The Jordan River then starts at the Dead Sea and runs north all the way to the Sea of Galilee, about 63, 65 miles, something like that. And Jericho, the city, lay on the western side of the Jordan River, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, of course. And they've crossed from east to west. And Jericho is sort of at the top of the Dead Sea. So you can draw that picture in your mind and you can see Jericho there. It's now in the place where Jericho was, if you will. And there is a modern city on that location, is in Israel. I wrote out a summary of chapter 6. I always try to, anytime I'm studying a book of the Bible, especially teaching a book of the Bible, I try to, at least in my mind, condense it first to its basic idea and then try to flush out the important parts of that. And I think chapter 6 of Joshua is one of the ones that's easy to do that. The summary would be this: Joshua and his conquering army destroyed Jericho after a 7-day battle that's carefully explained and precisely followed. And all the inhabitants of Jericho, except Rahab and her family, are completely destroyed, and the city itself is virtually eradicated. That's in the first 26 verses of chapter 6. And then verse 27 kind of closes all that by saying that as a result, Joshua's fame becomes widespread. And I thought about that verse as I was preparing this, and not that I wouldn't expect Joshua's fame to become widespread because of this. And we know that the people are holed up in Jericho because they already are shaking in their shoes or sandals from what they've already heard about Jericho, but what they heard about Joshua rather. But I wondered how it was widespread, because you see that the text is very clear that nobody in Jericho survived the assault by Joshua's army, not a single one of them. And I don't see any people that would be part of Jericho's army beaten feet, being absent after that. So how did the word get out? And the only thing I could come up with, well, there's nobody in Jericho left to tell them, and it's certainly not likely that anybody in Joshua's army would go AWOL and spread the word to the other to-be-conquered nations, get himself conquered, if that would happen, I think. So the only thing I could figure out is that perhaps right on the heels of the conquering of Jericho, somebody from some other nation observed, happened to walk by or come by, what has happened, and then that's the way the word got out. They didn't have the internet, and they didn't have news channels to look at. So the word did get out, and Joshua's fame goes through the roof. A couple other things about Jericho that I learned. I like to study. I like history. I like studying history, and this is certainly a book of history. And I like to do a little digging on this. Some things I found out, some in the text, some not necessarily in the text. The children of Israel have seen Jericho before, or they've been real close to Jericho. If you go back to Numbers 22, you find out that they camped just across the Jordan River, that is on the eastern side of the Jordan, in Numbers 22. And they learned, or we learned, from sources outside the Bible, that Jericho at the time was the oldest walled city in the ancient world. And its reputation and part of this spreading of the word of the fear that Joshua's army was bringing had to do with the fact that people surely thought that if this army of Joshua can conquer Jericho so completely, so utterly, then everybody's going to be shaking in their sandals. Because who can stop them if they can conquer Jericho? It was basically a fortress that could be easily defended and couldn't be penetrated. Now you can see from the picture up here, an artist's rendering behind me, I guess, not up there, behind me. You can see a rendering that the city was built on an embankment. So not only did you have two walls, but the people inside the inner wall had a tower, or towers in some pictures, that was about 32 feet tall. So from that tower, they could see anybody coming up, and that would give them a chance to button the hatches up if they needed to. The city of Jericho itself covered 738 feet by 262 feet. Now, to make that easier to see in your mind's eye, the way I tried to do it is I pictured two football fields. And everybody, most people at least, have been to, you've seen a football game, you know the size of a high school football field. Of course, it's 100 yards, and you add 30 yards to each end zone. So it's 360 feet. And a football field is 160 feet from sideline to sideline. Now, you compare that to Jericho, that's basically taking a little over, by length, two football fields and putting them like this. Widthwise, it'd be about 1.6 football fields. Now, that's not a small space, but it was easy for me to see, well, young men and older in Joshua's army could have easily walked around that city on that first day and the sixth day, because they only went around at one time, as we learned. On the seventh day, it's a little more of a challenge, but still getting around it would be pretty easy. Those walls were about 12 feet high and about 6 feet thick. And one of the commentaries I read said that it was actually a wall on top of a wall. They dig a trench, they build a wall, and then they build a wall on top of that wall to give it. So it's not only does it have a foundation, but it has a firmer foundation than would usually be found in a structure, ordinary building structure. That outside perimeter covered about 9 acres. That inside perimeter was about 3 acres. So the inner city, inside that inner wall, would be about 6 acres. As we learned, I think in one of David's lessons last week, there were last week or before, on the inside of that outer wall, there were houses or homes built into that wall, and that apparently is where Rahab herself lived. And one commentary writer says it's almost a sure thing, just knowing the way cities were built back then, that the poorer residents of Jericho would have lived inside the outer wall, between the walls, if you will. Centuries later, Jesus visited Jericho. That's in Luke 19. He had a notable encounter with a person. Anybody remember who that would be? In Luke 19? Well, it's Zacchaeus, the tax collector. Just 8 or 10 verses there in Luke 19. And so I asked myself when I read that, it didn't take me long to figure it out, but I asked myself initially, well, if Joshua destroyed the city of Jericho so completely, how in the world did Jesus, several hundred years later, how did he have this encounter with Zacchaeus? Well, the wall was rebuilt. Now, I'm going to save explaining how the wall was rebuilt and what the occasion was to a little bit later. So a little bit more about that. But there was a Jericho, It was destroyed by Joshua and his army, and then centuries later, Jesus visited the same city, or the rebuilt city. Before we get into the things that David wanted to point out, I came up with what I will refer to as 5 observations about chapter 6 of Jericho. And the first one is I want to point out is that verse 1 of Joshua 6 says that, it uses in my text, it says that the city was securely shut up and nobody could enter, nobody could exit. Now, we know why they didn't want to exit, because they feared Joshua's army, but nobody could get in either. And it wasn't that they had guards standing at the doors. You just couldn't get into the place. There was, and I'm told in reading, there was a spring inside the inner wall, a constant source of water that's to this day still produces fresh water. So the people could have holed up in the city for some time, and it happened to be at this time of the year, not long after the spring harvest. So they get the spring harvest in, and the water is ever flowing. So they probably could have stayed there for a long time. And if Joshua and his army chose to just stand ground and hold them out, try to starve them out, it would have been a long and difficult thing to do. Okay, so they could have done that, but they didn't. Now, from childhood, we know they didn't. Because from childhood, we've read about that. They marched around, they do that 6 times. They march around 7 times on the 7th day, and the walls come tumbling down. There's even a children's song to that effect, but don't ask me to sing it. Now, here's where I'm going with this. I want somebody, Travis, will you go flip back a couple pages? Read Joshua 2:24 for us, please. Joshua 2:24. Okay, who's speaking there? Does anybody remember? Who says, surely the Lord has given us? Anybody remember? Okay, it's the spies that Joshua sent in, and you know, they have the encounter with Rahab, and then they come back and they have this report. So the spies themselves, and what do they say? Surely the Lord what? What's that verb there? What's the verb preceding that? What is it? The Lord does what? The Lord what? Has given. Okay, you English majors, what tense is that? Past tense. The Lord has given. Okay, now let's look. Stick with me, Travis. Look at 6:2, verse 2 of chapter 6. And tell me, first of all, glance at it before you read it, and tell me who's speaking here. Yep, Art Miller answered that. The Lord is speaking. The Lord. Now read it for me, Travis. 6:2. All right. What's the verb there? Have given. Again, it's past tense. So the spies use have given, and God himself, when he's talking to Joshua, says, surely I have given. I looked at that in the New King James, the English Standard Version, and NIV, which are all easy for me to find. And that either have given or have delivered was used in either of those texts. Now that communicates something that's already happened. So the question I would ask you is, why all the cumbersome details that are laid out early in chapter 6 about this 7-day plan to take the city? A plan that, to me, now if I'm sitting inside Jericho, I might be scared to death of those people out there. But when they start doing this thing, what's kind of going through my mind? What am I thinking? What in the world are they doing? I'm supposed to be afraid of these folks. And then they come and do it again. And then they come and do it again. And after a while, it might start getting a little boring. But why that plan? Why does that have to be so detailed and so precise? And my question to you is there an application for today's church? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Well, I'll take a stab at it after studying about it sometime. I think that the fact that God laid out these very detailed instructions, a very detailed plan, is because he wanted his people to show careful and complete obedience to his plan. And this, in effect, was a sort of a test of faith. The Israelites already knew, or should have known, that God was going to give them the city. So that's it's like grace that we receive. God extends his hand of grace to us. He graciously gave them the city of Jericho, and all they had to do was accept it. How do they accept that gracious gift? How do they do that? Let me ask you a question that relates to that. What if on that seventh day they marched around that city 7 times and they blew that trumpet, but they didn't yell? What happens? That was part of the instructions. What do you think happens? They don't follow instructions. Now, the application that I see is God has a purpose for laying out instructions. Careful obedience to instructions is important, and any deviation from God's careful instructions must be viewed, as it surely would have been then, as an act of unfaith. That's not important to me. Why do we need to do that? We can accomplish what we need to accomplish without blowing that horn or without making that shout. Or how about just 6 times? That's a long way. That 7th one is really harder than the first one for sure. I think it was important to follow that. God has a purpose in everything that he said. What's God's ultimate purpose? What does it say? 1 Timothy, maybe chapter 2, maybe verse 4. What's he say? What does God want of his people? Somebody look it up for me right quick. I think it's 1 Timothy 2:4. I scratched it out last minute, so I got to find my hand scratching. 1 Timothy 2:4. Okay. God desires all of his people to do what? To be saved and come to knowledge of the truth. I think the lesson for us is that absolute and complete acceptance of what God says is something that we need to pay attention to. Any denial of what the Bible says that's very specifically laid out for us calls into question our desire to be obedient. Trust and obey. How many times we sung that? There's no other way. As I was preparing this lesson, I thought about the friction that now exists in one of the denominational churches that is very commonly found in this neck of the woods. I'm not going to mention their name, but I think you knew what I'm talking about. And the way I see the friction in that church, that if you take the whole group that are under that umbrella of that denomination and you say, here's that one group and here's that other group, they used to be pretty together. But one of the groups is saying now, I think we need to do more here and more here and more here. And this one is saying, no, we don't need to do that. We need to stay right where we are. But what can this group not say to this group? What can they not say? They can't say you have to do it, but they also can't say we need to follow the Bible, because what are they not doing themselves? They are not following the Bible. So I don't think that they can throw rocks at the people that are shifting to the far left in their denominational world, because that's kind of where they are already. Okay, second observation. Let's not forget the critical aim of the book of Joshua. Now, I had to think a little bit about this. What exactly is that? I did a little studying on this, and I went back really to Genesis 15:8. That's what 15:18, I believe. That's where God is having the conversation with Abraham, and you're familiar with that. I'm going to make you a great nation, and so forth. And then in Joshua chapter 1, verses 2 through 6, God, in his conversation with Joshua, kind of lays out that current day extension of the promise that was made to Abraham, because God has now led his people out of the captivity of Egypt. They've been in the wilderness all that period of time, and now they're going into the promised land. So Jericho and the conquering of Jericho is the first stage of the final campaign of God's deliverance of Israel. Israel was his people of that day. And this is basically the dawning of the deliverance of those people to the land of promise. And I saw that as having sort of a comparison to the resurrection of Jesus, because in my mind, the resurrection of Jesus compares to the conquering of Jericho, because that event, the resurrection of Jesus, conquered death for us. And it was the most important, in my judgment, the most important event in history that says we can enter into the promised land. If these folks had not conquered Jericho, they weren't going to have any impact on the rest of the Canaanites in that land. I sort of think that all that lay before the conquering of Jericho was kind of a historical preamble to the deliverance of God's people into the promised land. And likewise, all of the world history, spiritual history at least, all of the history in the time even up to Jesus, including Jesus up until the resurrection, that's just a preamble to opening the doors to our deliverance into our promised land. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, good point, Mike. And here now, let's not get ahead to chapter 7 and even beyond that. But here in chapter 6, do we see any deviation for anybody, Joshua or anybody in his army, of the plan of God? The answer is no, we don't see that. And so, yes, there are parallels with the New Testament, Mike. Let's go on. Notice how the number 7 figures quite prominently in the destruction of Jericho. Now, I intended us not to read the entire book of Jericho because I just didn't want to take that. I'm sorry, the book of Joshua. I didn't want to take that time. But verse 4 is where we find this first mention of the 7 priests, 7 trumpets, 7 days, 7 trips around the city on the 7th day. Now, you and I both know it's not the first time 7 was a significant number in Scriptures. What was the first time? 7 days of what? Creation. Yeah, the 7 days of creation. Now, I think just as Joshua 6 is associated, has the 7 days and 777, all that, that signifies completion, just like the 7 days of creation signifies God's completion of His creation. When we precisely follow God's plan, we get the same results that they do. They follow those 7, 7, 7, 7. They follow all of that precisely. And if we're following God's plan precisely, we're not breaking down walls that are physical. What wall are we breaking down? The wall that does what? What do walls do? What do walls do? Separate us. Separate a room from a room or a building from the outside. What does sin do? Separates us from God. Yeah. So precisely following God's instruction breaks down that wall of sin that separates us from God. So I think 7 is a significant number there. Fourth observation, is there anything we can glean from the use of the priest's trumpets? And in one place in there, maybe a couple places, they are called ram's horns. You think those horns made music? A ram's horn? Can you imagine that making some kind of music? What do you think it was? It's just a loud blast, a loud noise. Yeah. Well, if it wasn't used to make music, which I think it clearly wasn't, what is it really? What's the role it plays in there? What do they do right after the ram's horns blow? What do they do? That's when they shout, isn't it? Yeah, that's a signal that they shout. Now, I think it's also a signal that says not only is Jericho doomed, but God is present. And you have to understand, as surely the people of Joshua's day understood, what they're doing is not a military undertaking. This really doesn't look much like a military exercise. Yeah, the walls collapsed and all the people died, and the battle plan was accomplished, if you will, but it was a religious undertaking into the promised land, not a spiritual undertaking. I read in one commentary writer, this is an old commentary I have, and it was really pretty old, and he said, even if there's some other explanation or a secondary cause, or maybe a primary cause, for those walls collapsing, such as, say, an earthquake, the text is really clear that it happened at the precise moment immediately after the horns blow and the people shout. And for a long time, we didn't have any complete archaeological understanding of that. But now that they do that. And remember, also in Hebrews 11, chapter 30, these people of Joshua's time are mentioned, although very vaguely or very briefly. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down. By faith, they heard what God had to say. God told Joshua. Joshua told all the people. And they acted on that faith, which is called obedience, of course. And the walls fell down. They fell because it was God's plan. Speaking of archaeological significance, some of the commentary writers are all over the place on this. One I read said that there's really almost no archaeological evidence of Jericho ever happening. But others said, well, yeah, there's some archaeological evidence that was explained away, but now with the passage of a couple of hundred years, there's more evidence that shows the explaining away was invalid. So in effect, what they found is really a confirmation of the fall of Jericho. And what they have found is evidence that speaks to the thorough destruction of the city just as it's laid out. But my question to you in this fifth observation that I make, what do we know about Joshua's curse? That's in verse 26. And he says that any future rebuilding, and this is a quote, shall lay its foundation with his firstborn, and with his youngest he shall set up its gates. That's, what verse is that? 26, I believe. 26 and 27 maybe. Somebody, Dale, flip over to 1 Kings 16:34, if you will. 1 Kings 16:34. And read nice and loud. All right, so here's what happened. I think this is about 500 years after Joshua and his army laid Jericho to waste. This guy, Hiel, Hiel of Bethel, is a person, I don't know much about him, but he existed at the time when wicked King Ahab was in charge. So what he's doing here probably would not have turned Ahab's stomach at all, but he rebuilds Jericho. And part of the foundation is his firstborn son. And he used his other son to build the foundation of the, I believe it was the outside wall, wasn't it, Dale? Yeah, so that curse that Joshua laid out at the, verse 26 and 27 here came true some 500 years later. To me, that just simply signifies the fact that the scriptures, when all put together, have no contradictions at all. There's affirmation throughout the Scriptures of what God has said. Let's look at the leadership lessons that can be gleaned here. And let me see if I can. Okay. Help me out, who's up there in the crow's nest. Advance that slide for me. Yeah, advance that slide for me, Randy. Thank you. What lessons can we learn from Joshua 6, verses 1 through 5? That, if you haven't read it recently, and you can speed read through it now if you want to, but that's basically the battle plans being carefully outlined. That's God saying to Joshua, here's how we're going to go about this. And David says that here's some things we need to learn. God determines who we're going to be victorious. He did that then. He does that now. You don't have to read much of the New Testament to see the confirmation of that. God has already won. Go back to what we talked about earlier. I have delivered Jericho into you. We need to see it. Look at verse 2 there. And I usually can't read because there's not enough light in this room, but I'm going to find this. Yeah, verse 2, and the Lord said to Joshua, see. The Lord said to Joshua, see. The Lord said to Joshua, see. Is that really what he's saying? He's saying to Joshua, see. Look at that exclamation point. God's making a point. What's he really saying? What in 3 words is he saying? Open your eyes. Take a look. And so the point I would make there is that the leader of God's people at this time is Joshua. And God is telling him, open your eyes and see what I have done, or yet to be done. And how many places in the New Testament can we glean that from the Scriptures that Paul or Peter is really saying, open your eyes. Open your eyes. Don't put blinders on. Understand what God has said and what God expects of us. And if you do, then you'll be successful like the people of Joshua were in the city of Jericho. Let's be careful to follow the directions that God gives us, just like those people were. What are the leadership lessons from verses 6 through 11 of Joshua 6? Well, that's the short passage where they're making final preparations for the task. God has told Joshua what's going to happen or what needs to happen. And now Joshua is telling the people, everyone needs to know precisely what God's plan is and must follow it. Always take God with you into battles. Our battles are not against walled cities inhabited by people who are opposed to God's family. Our battles are against sin, but we take God into those battles just like the people took God at this time. Sometimes you don't have to open your mouth to be noticed. That's in verse 10. Even though we sometimes are following God's plan, we need to remember there's a time to be silent and there's a time to be vocal. Who else did I ask to read? I don't remember who it was. Somebody turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Tom, do that for me if you don't mind. Read Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and I want you to read the first verse of Ecclesiastes 3, and then the last half of chapter 3, verse 7. So it's verse 1 and 7b of Ecclesiastes 3. Okay. You me get somebody else? You don't have your glasses on. You get somebody else? Who's got that? Go ahead. 3:1, and then the last half of 7.
There's an appointed time for everything. There is a time for everything, every event under heaven. And a time to tear apart and a time to sew together. A time to be silent and a time to speak.
Okay, time to be silent and a time to speak. You know, even when we're following God's plan, sometimes we got to zip our lips. Proverbs 26:4. Who can find that right quick and read that for me? Proverbs 26:4.
Do not answer a fool according to his folly. He will also be like him.
Yeah. sometimes we find ourselves in interactions with non-Christians, and we have a tendency maybe to want to argue with them. Sometimes it's better to zip your lip, at least for a while, and you otherwise might fall into a trap. There's a time to be silent. There's a time to be vocal. Yes, sir. Darrell.
There were 6 days to be silent, except for the horn.
Good point. Good point. Yep. Yep. The first 6 days, they had those lips zipped, didn't they?
Can you imagine that many people having to be silent for 6 days?
Yeah. Good point. Good point. Darrell, for the folks that are listening through the web, Darrell makes the point that 6 days they were silent. On the 7th day, at the appropriate time with the sounding of the horn, they all shouted. Can you imagine how loud that shout would have been? So they were quietly following God's plan until it was time to be heard. Okay, any other points before we go on? Okay, let's look at verses. Roll me again, Randy, please. Next slide. What lessons can be learned from 6:12 through 14? This is the section where Joshua starts early. He says he gets up early, and he's beginning the process early in the day of executing the plan with all of God's people, of course. He doesn't delay the start of the day. If he's got to confront the enemies of God, and he has the opportunity to do it, he says, let's get it done. Let's get up and get started. Let's don't deviate from following God's plan. Sometimes God will require things to be done in the same way every time as he effectively did these first 6 days, but following the process was beneficial to them. So always follow the process. Don't try to shortcut it. Do things the right way every time, in every circumstance, and we will be blessed with the conquering that we need to do, just like those people were. Start executing the plan early, without delay. And some people delay and delay and delay from things they need to be doing. Randy, roll me again, please. What lessons can we learn from 15 through 20? This is the section where Joshua tells the people, he's told the people, that whatever you find in there, the gold, the silver, etc., that's not yours. That goes into the treasury. Effectively, God's always asked his people to give first and foremost to the treasury of the Lord. That's verses 18 and 19. No matter how strong the enemy is, there's no match for the strength of God. Here, God, I think, he doesn't want, and this is consistent with God before that time and God after that time. He doesn't want the people to be defiled. He don't want them to be tempted, doesn't want them to be tempted by anything that they find inside the city, anything that might have contributed to their pagan worship practices. And so his directions to Joshua and Joshua to the people are pretty clear. It's kind of like earlier when all the people are told to devote their first fruits to the Lord, first fruits of the harvest. God didn't want anything to happen that will, as he says in verse 18, to make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. That's verse 18. Don't want anything to make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. Now, this conquering of Jericho seems to go really quite well. It's hard to question the success of this. We don't have to go much further, as in the next chapter, to find out what happens when people don't follow the plan. So we'll look more at that next week, I'm sure, when David returns. Randy, roll me one more time, please. What lessons can we learn from 21 through 27? Now, here's the section which I haven't really talked about much. It's where Joshua tells the same two people that went into the land and came back and told how Rahab helped them. He tells those same two people, let's go get Rahab. Let's go get her and her family. Always keep the promises that you've made, especially those that have a spiritual foundation. Do all you can to ensure your family is saved. Rahab saved her family. I don't think it's a stretch to suspect that there were some people in Rahab's family that frowned upon what she had done, or not what she had done for the spies, but what her practices were. But yet, she's the person that saved the entire family. We need to do all we can to ensure our family is saved. Now, sometimes that still doesn't work, but we surely need to make an effort to do that. Everyone in the family has a role. Rahab probably wasn't the favorite daughter. If she had sisters, she might have been looked down upon before, but she was the hero of the family. You never know when a good deed might bless you down the road, show kindness to strangers. You never know how you may be blessed. Following God's instructions produces benefits. That's verse 27. Joshua's fame spread widely after this. And you have to think that the fame, not just of Joshua, but of the Israelite army, spread. So it's like Joshua is doing something precisely as God asked him to do, and he's leading the people to do precisely as God asked him to do. And that seems to have some benefit of them going forward until we find a couple of monkeys in the woodpile that seem to mess things up a little bit. Next week, David will be back and we'll launch into chapter 7 with that first snafu, if you will, in the conquering of the promised land. Please read chapter 7. I love reading Joshua. Then I love reading Judges until we get to about the last 5 chapters, and it kind of goes south. Well, it goes south before that, but I love reading the history of God's people, and I keep seeing parallels, if you will, between what they did well and what they didn't do well into what happens today in God's family if we do things well and if we sometimes don't do things very well. Thank you for your attendance. Unless you got questions that I might be able to answer, I'll take those. Hey, Mike, go.
Before you do, let me make a quick point, which it's not original to me, and I wish it was. But as far as the destruction of Jericho and the walls of Jericho, sometimes we don't consider how many people were walking around that city. That was about maybe as much as 2 million people walking around that city. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the University of Tennessee football stadium in Knoxville that holds 108,000 people. If you're ever in there, when all those 108,000 Tennessee fans are roaring at something that Tennessee has done, that makes a lot of
A lot of noise.
So you
Yeah.
consider now that Jericho, if you look at the whole stadium, is approximately the same size as that whole stadium. Now, if you take 2 million people walking around the city of Jericho 7 times, once each day, 7 times on the last day, and then yelling with shout, how much noise would 2 million people make?
Yeah.
Shout. It's been said that there was a football game somewhere in California that the people got excited and they stomped their feet and yelled, and it actually showed up on the side of the ground.
Yeah. They made a lot of noise, which, among other things, had to be intimidating to the people inside the walls. That many people walking around the city. I wonder, first time I thought of this, as an old military guy, I have to wonder, were they walking in step? That would be even more intimidating to me. Yeah.
In that case, God was victorious through voice. Parallel with today. It's all about the word.
It's all about the word, isn't it?
The voice.
Yeah. Okay, that's all I got. Did I hear the second bell? I heard a bell. Was that the second one? Okay, by the clock it has to be. Thank you very much. David should be back next week, Lord willing.